Good evening, everyone. And to my friends in the Mediterranean ballroom, which is next door, you are welcome to stay there and enjoy the festivities on the screen, or you're welcome to come in here and join us. Okay. Two silkworms decide to have a race. They end up in a tie. All right. Good thing I'm not this evening's speaker. Hi, everyone. My name is Dan Peters, and my wife and I run a foundation in Cincinnati, and I'm also on the board of the Philanthropy Roundtable. And on behalf of the staff and the board of the Roundtable, I cannot tell you enough how thrilled we are to have all of you here, including all of you in the Mediterranean ballroom. Now, I've got a simple job, and that is my job is to introduce you to Sandra Swirsky, who will introduce you to our speaker. One could argue, can't you just let Sandra introduce the speaker? No, I was trained at the Department of Motor Vehicles, so this is the way we do things. Okay, now, I love Sandra, but you probably already know that. It's kind of like asking, is a 40-pound robin large? Yes, okay. Here's why you should like Sandra. And you'll have to bear with me on this one, including those in the ballroom, because this affects all of you. Let me tell you why. It was back in 2003 and 2004 that there was legislation that was on the verge of being passed that would have given all of you the opportunity, seriously, all of you, everyone in this room would have been required to provide detailed operational and financial information every 5 years to the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, to receive approval to continue, to maintain your tax-exempt status. It wasn't just all of us here, it was every recipient to whom all of you give money, with, I believe, the exception of churches, synagogues, and schools. Everybody else would have been required to file that information. Fortunately, thanks to several folks here, Heather Higgins and Dr. Jack Templeton, whose daughter, Heather Templeton Dill, is here, both board members, and Sandra Swirsky, that did not happen. Sandra Swirsky is the executive director of ACR, the Alliance for Charitable Reform. So in that capacity, would you please join me and welcome Sandra to come up to introduce our speaker?
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for the low bar. Just kidding. Thank you, Dan, very much for your kind words, and hello to everyone. It has been my honor and a privilege to lead the Alliance for Charitable Reform for over a decade now, and get to work with Adam and his outstanding team at the Philanthropy Roundtable on work that I love. And that work is to protect philanthropic freedom from Washington. So my team and I spend a lot of time in our sandbox, which includes Capitol Hill and the White House. And in our travels, we meet with and work with millennials of all stripes. So here's my take. For millennials, it's not trendy to be conservative. It's not popular to be conservative. And it's not what your friends are doing. I'm told it's what the nerds do. But that needs to change. And this evening, we are in for a real treat. We're going to hear from a young rising star from Washington. Kristen Soltis Anderson is going to share with us how conservatives can better woo millennials. She should know. She was named Time Magazine's 30 People Under 30 Who Are Changing the World. And this couldn't come at a more important time. Ladies and gentlemen, your philanthropic freedom is being challenged. Allow me to read a few headlines about you. From Bloomberg, the super rich are stockpiling wealth in black box charities. From the New York Times, how tech billionaires hack their taxes with a philanthropic loophole. And my personal favorite, 3 simple steps to protect charities and American taxpayers from the rise of donor-advised funds. It is just jaw-dropping. And this is what we're up against. So growing our army to push back against this nonsense is essential. And tonight, in a very timely presentation, Kristen is going to offer us new tools and strategies to help us do just that. Kristen, I welcome you to what many say is the biggest stage in philanthropy. Thank you, and let's welcome Kristen.
Good evening, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I always love an opportunity to come back to my home state of Florida, especially given that we are on the eve of the Florida-Georgia football game, one of the most important events of the year. So I'm especially glad to be back in the Sunshine State. Go Gators. I'm also very glad to be here because I believe so passionately in the work that you all are doing. When I first got engaged with Philanthropy Roundtable through Sean Parnell, to begin doing a little bit of research about some really key topics, I learned more about what you all were doing. It just strikes me as so enormously valuable in this moment when a lot of Americans feel like there are huge problems we need to face in our society. Inequality, poverty, there are all sorts of things that we need to be doing, and yet without the work that you all do, so often people turn to government as the answer. As a high school student and a member of the Cypress Creek High School debate team, I had a 10th grade history teacher who was also my debate coach. I would later find out he's very progressive and wonders what kind of a monster he made. But he educated me a little bit about the Cold War, got me interested in the writings of Václav Havel and his take on individual liberty, human dignity, what it was like being a dissident during the Soviet occupation of Czechoslovakia, and then what it was like being the president of a newly free Czechoslovakia and later Czech Republic. And in his book, Summer Meditations, which is really unique as a book that was written by someone who's a current head of government, he writes about how so valuable to the sort of rebuilding of Czech society was civil society, was the ability of those outside of government to make change, to tackle important things in the culture, to help make sure that society was thriving rather than just relying on the state. And so since then I have been, that has sort of been baked into my DNA about how I view the world, and that means that for me, the work you all do is essential. So thank you so much again for having me. So I'll begin with just a little bit of what I think Jonah Goldberg would call rank punditry. I won't spend too much time, saying things that you could turn on cable news and hear, but I think it's important to set the scene for why millennials over the long term are so important. So we have an election coming up in less than 2 weeks. Still a long time, but also very, very close. And something about this election does not feel like a wave election. People have talked about, man, every election over the last couple of years has been a wave election back and forth. And people about a year ago, really when you looked at the data about where things were headed, thought this would be a wave election. The blue wave was coming. And yet as we approach Election Day with less than 2 weeks to go, it doesn't feel like a wave. And as a pollster, feelings are not how I'm supposed to be making these decisions. It's supposed to be based on data. So let me give you some data points. Right now, the generic ballot, the question that pollsters ask to voters, in the absence of saying, are you going to vote for candidate A or candidate B, when they ask just, who are you going to vote for, the Republican or the Democrat? On that question, Democrats are winning by 8, which might sound like a lot. Might sound like, well, that sounds like wave election kind of numbers. But to put it in contrast, in 2006, the last time there was a real blue wave, the polls were showing D plus 15 at this stage in the game. So this is not the same political environment as we saw in 2006. Another thing that has led me to believe this is not necessarily the kind of obvious wave election that we're used to, that something, to use the scientific term, squirrely is going on with this election, is that in the latest NBC Wall Street Journal poll, number one, they asked what is the president's job approval, and 45% said they approved of the job the president is doing, which sounds low in historical context, but is actually the highest rating that President Trump has gotten in their poll. His numbers have not declined as we have headed toward the midterms, but in fact, he is in relatively good position. The other number that stuck out to me from the poll that makes me think this is not likely to be a typical wave election, not like 2006, not like 94, is on the question of which party do you trust more to bring about change in Washington. Republicans win that question by 1 point. Now, in a normal wave election, you would see voters very agitated, very eager for change. And indeed, on this question where you say, do you think the country's on the right track or the wrong track, only about 4 in 10 think we're on the right track. There are a lot of voters dissatisfied with where things are at. And yet, when you ask them who they think is going to bring about change, the party out of power is not who they trust or who they're necessarily looking to for that change. So with that context in mind, I think this is why, coming from the polling world, I'm not yet convinced this is going to be a wave election. It's likely to be a very good night for Democrats, but I don't think that we, at this point, are looking at something quite like we saw in 2006 when Nancy Pelosi became Speaker. But underlying all of those top-line numbers are some things that I think are very troubling, whether you are politically conservative or progressive, and that is the fraying of our society along demographic lines. In the 2008 election, there was a gender gap. It was in the single digits. The way women voted about, I think, 8 points more Democratic than men did. As you got to sort of the 2012 election, that had grown a bit. We were now in the double digits, but still, I think, either in the high teens, low 20s. Even as recent as the last election, you were still looking at a gender gap that was around 20-some points. In that NBC Wall Street Journal poll, where Republicans were doing a little bit better than they had been doing in the month before, it was because while women were breaking by 25 points for Democrats, men were breaking by 14 points for Republicans, a 39-point gender gap. And gender's just one of the fault lines along which I am beginning to see larger and larger and larger divisions in our society. I think another one that really sticks out to me is generation, and this is the topic that I am ostensibly here to talk to you tonight about. So I got interested in understanding my generation's political views when around the time of the 2008 election, I had moved to Washington. I was working, updating spreadsheets, answering phones at a polling firm, learning the ropes of the public opinion industry. And all of a sudden, all of these folks who back in high school and college had thought I was the strange one for being the debate kid, for being the political science major who really wanted to be a political scientist. All of those folks who could not have cared less about politics, all of a sudden cared. They cared. This man named Barack Obama had inspired them. They cared a lot and wanted to be more engaged. And I thought that was great. But all of a sudden I started getting asked some variation on the question of, well, Kristen, how can you be a Republican? You seem so nice and normal. Now, I know not everybody in this room is Republican, but nonetheless, it sort of underscores that suddenly something was happening in my generation. So I tried to write my master's thesis on this topic to understand, well, is this normal? Isn't it the case that the kids are always more progressive? Wasn't it Winston Churchill who said that if you're young and conservative, you have no heart, and if you're old and liberal, you have no brain? Well, I would like to say, for anyone in the room who may be old and liberal, if there are any of you here, I believe you have a brain. I would like to change your mind, but I believe you have a brain. But there are plenty of young conservatives. Ronald Reagan won young voters by a 19-point margin in his re-election in 1984. It is not out of the question for young people to lean to the right. It just was out of the question all of a sudden at that moment in 2008. And I wondered, was this something that was going to persist, or was this just a one-time thing? Was it just, well, Barack Obama was an inspirational figure? And what I found in my research was pretty striking. It was that for young people, not only is it not always the case that they lean left or right, in fact, as recently as the 2000 election, young people and their grandparents split their votes about the same way. Pretty close, 50-50 between Al Gore and George W. Bush. Not a huge generation gap in that election, and nothing like the yawning generation gaps we see today. But additionally, there was this idea that young people would one day wake up and become conservative, that one day they would wake up and realize that they were paying taxes, that the government was in their business, and that they wanted nothing to do with the left. And this was predicated upon the idea that young people were going to go out and buy homes and get married and have kids and go to church on Sunday. And these are all things that the data shows us young people are doing less of these days. And to the extent they're doing them at all, they're doing them later in life, after they've had a decade or more of being engaged in our nation's politics and forming their views. So it's important for those who are engaged in any kind of work in the political space to realize that talking to young people is important, because the way they think about politics when they're young will have echoes throughout the way they think about the role of government in society for years to come. So I want to leave you with what I think are a couple key takeaways that I have come across in my research on the millennial generation, in hopes that you can use it with your organizations to better connect with young adults in your area. So first, I want to make some definitions clear. The millennial generation, Pew Research Center now defines them as those born from 1981 to 1996. So the very youngest kids, the ones who are on college campuses these days, the ones who are written about in The Coddling of the American Mind, a wonderful book that I am going to plug on behalf of the author, Greg, who is here tonight. Those are Generation Z. And there's beginning to be more and more data coming out about them that suggests they will be different than their older millennial brothers and sisters. But I'm going to focus tonight on what I've learned about millennials. And again, these are folks who are now mid-20s up to their mid to late 30s. They are the parents of many of the kids who are entering the school system these days. They are not just the kids in college. They are the parents of the kids in our public school system. And so understanding their views, I think, is incredibly important. So the few things I would have you take away. Number one is that my generation is one that is not in love with commitment. When you take a look at things like, for instance, would you rather have a driver's license? Data shows that nowadays, well, so I should step back. When I turned 16, I was very excited to get my driver's license. My dad had a 1988 Acura Integra sitting there in the driveway that just had my name on it, and I was so excited for the freedom that would come with a driver's license. But nowadays, data shows that a significant number of kids are graduating high school. Not just they don't go to the DMV on their 16th birthday. They graduate from high school without having gotten a driver's license. Because why do they need one? They're not going to get a car. They can just Uber around. They can just bum a ride off someone else or take public transit. The commitment of having a car, something that I was so excited about, is something that even for my own generation, an awful lot of people are opting out of. When it comes to something like marriage, the average age at which a millennial gets married is significantly older than it was for someone who was young just 20 years ago. And part of that is because think about the world that millennials have grown up in. If you grew up in the 80s and 90s, you probably got a certain set of advice from your parents, which was work hard, go on to college, get that college degree, find someone nice, settle down, buy a house, put some money aside into the stock market to save for your retirement. And then all of a sudden, the 2008 financial crisis happens. And they look around and they say, well, gosh, buying a house, the houses next door are all foreclosed on. Get married. Your generation has seen unprecedented levels of divorce. Go to college, get a degree. All my friends went to college, we've all got degrees, and now we're all working in minimum wage jobs, trying to make ends meet and pay our student loans. So all of these things you told me were responsible commitments, I'm not quite sure I think of them that way. And so for the millennial generation, sort of being a little resistant to committing to something, wanting to take a wait-and-see approach, wanting to be a little more reserved, I think is an important way to think about us. It's not that we're a flighty generation. I think we have very good reason to be skeptical of making some of the commitments that previous generations told us were a sure bet. But I think it's also valuable for folks on the right to understand why millennials are making some of the different choices they're making when it comes to things like family or home ownership. The second thing I think it's important to keep in mind about millennials is our relationship with labels, and especially in the political space. So I want to ask a question. How many of you, the very first time you ever bought music, you bought a vinyl record? Hands up. It's okay. No judgment. What was the vinyl record you bought? Elton John. Ooh, which one? That's a very good choice. Who else? Vinyl record. What did you pick? Beatles paperback writer. Very nice. All right. Does anyone in here, the first thing you ever bought was an 8-track? I never get any hands for 8-track. Oh, I have one. What was the 8-track you purchased? John Denver's Greatest Hits. All right. All right. Who in here is like me? First thing you ever purchased was a cassette tape. What was your cassette? Alanis Morissette. Very nice. Who else? Cassette tape. In the back. Pardon? The Police, okay. I was New Kids on the Block, The Right Stuff. It was excellent. Anybody in here young enough that the first thing you ever bought was a CD? Oh, we have a CD person. What was the CD? In Sync. Oh, God bless you. We need to talk later. When you bought that CD, you were committing to NSYNC. You were committing to a bunch of tracks of NSYNC, all in a certain order. And maybe if you were really crafty, you could go into your CD player and say that you really wanted it to play track 4 first and program a playlist. But if you had a vinyl record, I mean, you were committing. You were committing to Elton John for all those tracks. I was committing to New Kids on the Block for all of those songs in a particular order. Nowadays, if you go to a college campus, people have not purchased a physical thing to give them music. That is like a foreign concept. They subscribe to Spotify, they listen to streaming services, and as a result, they can create whatever playlist they want. A little Elton John, a little NSYNC, a little Police, a little Beatles, whatever they want. That might not be the musical selection of a college student today. It might be my musical selection. But they can create whatever playlist they want to suit their needs. So if that's the way you're doing something as basic as picking music, why would you choose the entire Republican or Democratic playlist? All of the Republican songs, all of their positions, all of the Democratic songs, all of their positions. You probably wouldn't. You might want to say, I take a little of column A and a little of column B. And so we see a lot of young people considering themselves political independents because they don't feel well served by the two parties that are on offer today. This is part of why Donald Trump is president. It's not that the Republican Party did swimmingly with young voters in the 2016 election. It's that Democrats abdicated their role and wound up leaving them on the table for Republicans to take just enough of to pull off a win. So young voters are very dissatisfied with, I think, both of the parties, and it leaves a big opportunity for anyone who wants to step in and say they're doing something that transcends those labels. It doesn't just apply, by the way, to political party. If you think about it, I look at a lot of polling data that shows young people very likely to say they pray daily, very likely to consider themselves people of faith, but not very likely to identify themselves with a particular religious tradition. They want a little of column A and a little of column B. And so understanding young people, I think, means knowing that they are going to try to leave the traditional labels we try to place on them. And finally, I think it's important to talk about the values and sort of the mission that young voters have, and where I think this can line up very closely with a lot of the work that some of you all are doing. So not to bring up another Jonathan Haidt book, but I'm assuming many of you in here have read The Righteous Mind, which lays out, in moral foundations theory, what are the taste buds that people are using, moral taste buds, to decide what's right and what's wrong, in the same way that your real taste buds would decide what's salty and what's sweet. And he finds that for the political left, they tend to really focus on things like care and fairness. And for the political right, they tend to include care and fairness, but also talk about things like tradition, talk about things like purity. So for young people, how are they making moral decisions? So how many of you have ever spoken to a millennial who said, well, I don't know why that would be illegal. It's not hurting anyone. This was sort of an argument that was used to great effect, I think, when it came to the debate over marriage equality. Lots of young people going, well, no one's getting hurt here, so why wouldn't we have marriage equality? No one's being hurt. But at the same time, young voters are among the strongest advocates for things like animal rights, because they believe something or someone is being hurt. They are more likely than other generations to view things like binge drinking, extramarital affairs, and hard drug use as being morally unacceptable, and yet at the same time are more open to things like using marijuana because, in their mind, it's not hurting anyone. And so I think it's important to understand that for young people, their moral compass is really centered around these questions of care and fairness. And a lot of what you all are doing is trying to care for people. It's trying to care for people and create a more just society, not through government mandate, but by opening doors of opportunity and ensuring that everyone has a chance to succeed, that everyone has a fair shot at living the American dream. And so I think in that context, even though we think of young people as perhaps having this more left-of-center moral compass, I think if we did a Venn diagram of what the people in this room and in the Mediterranean ballroom stand for, and what young people all stand for, I think you'd actually find that on the care and fairness piece, there is in many ways a lot more overlap than you might expect. So I'll just end by saying there are about 75 million millennials in the United States today. We are a force to be reckoned with. And I know the stereotype of my generation is that we are all fairly lazy and fairly entitled. I know the New York Times, for instance, did a story on what it's like when millennials enter the workplace that featured a young man who told his boss he needed time off to go to the funeral of a friend. And it turned out, not only did he not have a friend who died, he just wanted some me time to build a tree house and was exposed because he posted Instagram photos of this tree house. And so he got called out by his company. And people think that's what millennials are like. But I want to leave you on what I hope is an uplifting note. So after the 2012 election, I did a survey on behalf of the College Republican National Committee. They wanted to diagnose what did they need to do to make better outreach to their peers. And in the survey, we asked, what 2 or 3 words do you most wish your friends would use to describe you? And we included, of the options they could choose, the laundry list of things you might find in a New York Times piece about the millennial generation. Unique, cool, optimistic, open-minded, tolerant, adventurous, and so on and so forth. And you know what the top 4 answers were? Caring, hardworking, intelligent, and responsible. I think those are all things that the folks in this room can believe, all right, if the next generation is really about those things, we might be okay after all. Thank you very much.
Kristen, that was just outstanding. My first album, yeah. Mediterranean folks, did you enjoy that? Yeah, yeah. My first album, of course, was Mantovani. No, it's a joke. It's a joke. You have, never mind. We're not even going there. Okay, now we have someone's birthday. I'm doing this by the proverbial seat of my pants. We have someone's birthday. I'm not sure who it is, so if we can get the first indicator that's going to, yeah. So if you, I think I know who that is, but before I announce the name, is there another photo to help us? Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of The Price is Right. John Jackson, come on down. Where, John, are you here? Or did he sneak into the Mediterranean ballroom? Is he here, John? Oh, here he is. Where's your Carrie? What happened to his, oh, there he is. Come on up here. Come on up here. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to
That's great stuff.
Dear John, happy birthday to you. Look at this. Woo!
Oh my
Look
goodness.
at that. Oh, look at.
That's very nice.
All right.
I'm not sure how you pulled that out.
All right.
Yeah, right. Seriously? This is a trick one, right? Yeah. All right, you probably want an explanation for that, right? Wherever it went. So I just want you to know that I was dressed that way on the very first day of my job as executive director of the Adolph Coors Foundation. That's how we introduced me to the Denver community. Well, there's actually a story to it. So my predecessor, many of you may know her, was Sally Rippey. And Sally had this habit, I called it a best practice, of sort of during the day she would change clothes depending on what meeting she would go to. So she would always make sure that she matched shoes, skirt, top, earrings, glasses. She had many pairs of glasses. So she would change clothes throughout the day. So when I took over the job, I wanted to show the community that I had learned from Sally's best practices. So during the course of her retirement party, I wore 3 different outfits, complete. So I had people helping me with the heels and such earrings, which I wasn't quite used to changing that fast, but it was a lot of fun. So Amanda and Susie and Lindsay and all of you who did this, thank you very much. We can add a few adjectives to the already talented Roundtable team, and thoughtful and kind are the ones that I would add. I'd also like to add something to my bucket list, and that would be revenge.
This is for you. John is a distinguished member of the board of the Philanthropy Roundtable. So, Kristen, I meant to ask, you'll be around afterwards for questions and so on? Okay, bear with me. We have one final thing, and I'm told that on the screen will be displayed the salon, which will be following right after this. We have 4 different ones, and Amanda and Lindsay said to me, let them know that there is dessert and adult beverages are available. And by the way, Dan, don't think because they're adult beverages that it's pronounced saloon. Don't mispronounce it. So I think it's self-evident. We've got 4 great speakers and sessions. So make sure you choose one. And conversely, if you don't, we have plenty of food and so on here and in the Mediterranean Ballroom. So with that, thank you so much. You've been a great audience, and Kristen will be here for any questions. Thank you.